Washington Journal continues.
John Wonderlich is Policy Director at the SunlightFoundation. Thanks for being here.
Thank you.
On this 4th of July, we're here to talk about the 46th anniversary of FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. What is it? Who uses it?
So the Freedom of Information Act is an absolutely bedrock law for accountability in democracy, and it basically says that the citizens of the United States have the right to get access to any information that the government has. And it basically says we own the information that the government has, and we can get access to it by requesting it.
And tell us about the history of it. Where did it come from? When did it start?
Sure. So it started in the U.S. in 1966 is when it was first passed. And then it's been revised a number of times since then. It wasn't until the 70s that it really grew teeth and became more effective. And it's been revised every decade or so since then. And it's the subject of a lot of debate and legislation right now. But despite all the difficulty and complexity in keeping a strong and effective Freedom of Information Act, it's also the source of tons of important journalism and oversight.
And how has it changed over the years? You talked about how it is I don't know if the word evolving is correct, but it does change over time. So at what times has it been the most free? At what times has it gotten more constricted?
So I think it was the most constricted when it was first passed because it was so new and people didn't know how to use it, and there was a signing statement that basically restricted how effective it could be. And then it was really after Watergate that it became a much more effective instrument. Then over the years it's been restricted over national security issues or expanded to take advantage better of technology and the ability to disclose electronic records. And now we're seeing a lot more fights and a lot more legislation trying to restrict the Freedom of Information Act for national security information or for other kinds of technological reasons. So it's certainly an ongoing source of contention.
The Freedom of Information Act pertains to federal documents and information. So what happens if someone's looking for information on a state or local level?
So we're lucky in one sense in the U.S. that every state, since the passage of the Federal Freedom of Information Act, every state has a similar law. So if you're looking for city records or state records in general, you can submit a request to your state and get the request fulfilled.
Here are the number of FOIA requests received by the federal government. In fiscal year 2011, there were 640,000. The following year, a dip there, 597,000. I'm sorry, the previous year, there was a growth in 2011, and then going back to 2009, 558,000. So an increase over time. Is there a reason for that?
That's a good question. I mean, to some degree, a lot of FOIA requests are caused by corporations making requests for business purposes, but there's also any number of reasons that different kinds of activism could cause a surge in requests or scandals of different kinds. I mean, to characterize that huge number of requests is pretty difficult, so I'm not sure it would be responsible for the change over time.
Give us an example of how a journalist or a citizen would use the Freedom of Information Act to get information.
Sure. So one example I really like is members of Congress that like to say that they're against what they would call pork barrel spending, and there have been a number of journalists that submit Freedom of Information FOIA requests to federal agencies and say, please release to me, I'm requesting a copy of all the correspondence that members of Congress have sent to your agency where they make a spending request. And then it often takes a little bit of time, but what they get back are members of Congress that say they're anti-spending will often submit one request after another saying, please spend money in my district. And that makes for a great story, and it's something that we wouldn't find out without the Freedom of Information Act request. But there are hundreds and hundreds of other kinds of requests that people can make and get information from the government, and anyone can do it. It's generally free, and you're free at any time to make a request of any federal agency.
Do you use a form? Do you write a letter? How do you tell us about the mechanics of it?
Yeah, so in general the mechanics are that you write a letter, and that can seem a little bit daunting, but if you just do a Google search for Freedom of Information Act request or FOIA request, there are a number of fantastic guides that walk you through the process, and every agency also is going to have a web page devoted to explaining how to make a FOIA request and who to address it to, and some pointers so that you can submit a FOIA request that is narrow enough and makes good enough sense that they'll be able to fill it.
John Wonderlich is with the SunlightFoundation. He serves as its policy director. Let's go to the phones and hear from John, a Democrat in Providence, Rhode Island. Good morning.
Good morning. I have a question. What is the ultimate value of someone, once they write this letter and get the information that they're looking for, what does it do in terms of change to take place? Once you find out this information, how do you go about then making a change so you can correct whatever issue it is that you're looking for? And also, this is not directed actually at the gentleman here from the Freedom of Information Act, but also to the host who actually allowed the last guest that you had to not agree or disagree that the president was born in Hawaii. I actually found that to be absurd that you allowed him to get away with saying that, and I would like your comment on that as well. Thank you.
I'll take the last part of that, and then we can go to John Wonderlich for the first part. We asked the question of Ed Fulner of whether or not he supported Donald Trump's belief that, or claim that President Obama may not qualify to be the president due to citizenship issues, and he declined to side with either side. So you can take that for what it's worth and make your own decisions about what you think about that. But we're not here to put a word into anyone's mouth. We like to let our guests speak for themselves. So John Wonderlich, let's jump on the first part of where do people go once they do a FOIA request? How important is the information they get, and how can they deal with it?
Sure. Well, sometimes getting the information, especially if it's in the hands of a journalist, and explaining what you got is enough to cause immediate change because you've discovered something scandalous. Like in California recently when some of the public servants were getting paid, $600,000 a year or something ludicrous for a city employee. And those revelations were enough to cause enormous changes to happen very quickly. But sometimes what you find out through a FOIA request is a lot more tricky and a lot more complicated. And the question is, like, how do you cause change in a democratic society? And the answer is sometimes it's really hard. But what I would say is, in order for us to have popular sovereignty, it's the 4th of July, and the idea is that we're supposed to have self-determination. The first step to that is being able to understand what your government's doing. So this is really a bedrock law for democracy.
Joanne in Flint, Michigan joins us now on our independent line. Good morning.
Good morning.
What do you have to say to John Wonderlich?
Well, I did I applied for my own individual Freedom of Information Act, and I was denied. And I didn't follow up.
Joanne, what information were you looking for, and who did you ask for the information?
I went through the request form. I used the request form, and I got the number that give you and everything. And it took them about 8 months to deny me, and mainly they denied me based on some medical information, and I don't know who medical information that they think they were keeping from me, because it was my own individual.
And Joanne, who were you asking for the information? Were you asking the federal government? Were you asking the state?
Yeah, I was asking that through the Department of Justice, the FBI.
Okay.
Well, so despite the Freedom of Information Act's importance, that doesn't guarantee that you're going to get a result to your request. There are a number of exceptions and exemptions so that we can protect information that really shouldn't be public, because there's certainly a lot of that kind of information. I don't know what your request was in this case, but it also could be that sometimes a request is not narrow enough, or sometimes it's described in a way that they can't find the right kinds of documents. So sometimes submitting a successful FOIA request is a matter of submitting multiple requests and refining it over time, or talking to the agency about what it is you want and figuring out what they might have and how you can submit a better request. And sometimes you have to sue to end up getting the information.
John Wonderlich, what are some of the exemptions? We've seen images of documents that will be handed over, and they can be redacted at times. So you might get the document, but areas might be blacked out. So how does a federal agency decide what it can turn over, and what it has to take out, and what it just can't give you at all?
So those exemptions are defined by law in the Freedom of Information Act. And they're very specifically defined. They're for things like the internal personnel issues within an agency, or commercial or trade secrets that the government may have access to. They're not going to release that and share it with everyone else. Ongoing investigations that have to do with the police, any kind of national security issue. If it could cause harm to the nation's security, then it's not going to be disclosed. There's also an exemption specifically carved out for oil wells, which has always struck me as sort of a strange ad hoc exemption. But that's sort of the nature of these exemptions. They're very specifically laid out by law, and then there are professionals within each agency that are trained and that have to follow the law when deciding what to release and what not to.
Going to the website FOIA.gov, we can see a listing of backlogs of requests. In fiscal year 2011, 83,000 requests were in a backlog status. The year before that, 70,000. Prior to that, 76,000 backlog in the backlog system. How does that happen, and how long does it take?
So often requests, so there's a requirement that the agency has to respond within 20 days. In practice, that means they send you a letter that says, we got your request and we're working on it. And then you'll just kind of get that letter indefinitely for some kinds of requests. And so the backlog is the reference to these pending requests that have never been answered or finally dealt with. And that happens because maybe the agency doesn't want to deal with them, or maybe they lack the resources to get through all of the backlog of requests. There are a number of different causes for it, but it's certainly a problem, and it's one we'd like to see dealt with.
Let's hear Diane, Republican caller, Long Island, New York, weighing in on the program. Hi.
Good morning. I think you just answered part of my question, but I had another one. If I, as a private citizen, petitioned, say, Attorney General Holder for those documents, Fast and Furious, could I have a better shot at getting them? I mean, it's a tongue-in-cheek question, but how much teeth does FOIA really have? Is it only a paper tiger?
And Diane, can I ask you, have you ever thought of filing a Freedom of Information Act request?
I haven't had the opportunity yet to do that. No, I haven't.
Okay, thanks for your call.
So it depends on which documents. I think that you are absolutely free to submit a Freedom of Information Act request to the Department of Justice asking for whichever documents you want. Now, the president claimed executive privilege before Congress and basically said, because I'm the president, we're not going to give this to you because it pertains to my prerogatives. So that means that those particular documents, they're very unlikely to release as a result of a Freedom of a FOIA request. Now, one of the brilliant things about FOIA, though, is that it means that you don't have to trust the executive branch to make a decision about what gets released. If they refuse to release something and you disagree with their justification, you can sue them. And that sounds maybe litigious or something, but what that means is that you can take one branch of government and hold the other branch of government accountable by pitting them against each other through a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit. So what we saw with the contempt vote was Congress versus the presidency, and the courts haven't really been involved. So it's actually an interesting question, what would happen if the courts were to litigate a FOIA request about those same documents.
Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, John is on the line, an independent caller. Hi.
Hey, how are you this morning?
Good.
I have a two-part question. One is, I would like to find out what exactly, through a county municipality, if you were trying to get information from a police agency, what would be the procedure to do that? And number two, I've been involved in a probate situation, and it's very litigious. It's gone on for 5 years, and it's in South Carolina. It's private when a trust is involved. What are my chances if I'm trying to get information about a judge and their rulings beforehand, an administrative law judge, something to that effect?
So generally, the judicial branch is exempt from the Freedom of Information Act, just like generally the legislature is exempt. As to an administrative law judge, I'm not sure. I would assume that they're also exempt, but it varies from state to state. So to find out exactly how your state's Freedom of Information Act works, I would recommend searching for the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. And they have a fantastic state-by-state guide to how the open records laws work in each state that would give you, I think that would be a great first step.
Here's a question from Don. How much does a FOIA cost?
So the requests are generally free, but if you're doing something that's involved and involves searching through a database or reproducing lots of records, or if it's going to take an agency putting 15 staffers on it for 6 months to go through a bunch of records, then they will often charge people for it. And how much they charge can be contentious and something that people argue over. And there's also something called a fee waiver. So if you are a journalist or if you have a public interest reason for requesting the information, you can get them to waive the fee that they would charge you for it. So generally it's free, but it can cost money in a way that gets complicated.
The second part of Don on Twitter's question is, what happens if the document they send me doesn't have the information that I want, and do I need to know a specific document exists? So tell us about the sort of phishing process that can go on. If you want to know the answer to a question, how do you figure out where to start and how to actually ask for it?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think lots of journalists' careers are defined by their ability to do that well, basically. So you can't use the Freedom of Information Act to just ask an agency a question and demand an answer. You have to be able to request a document that exists. But that also doesn't mean that you have to know the name of the document and where it is. You can do things like say, I would like all the emails received by the following officials within an agency within the following dates that have to do with a certain topic. And often that's just specific enough that they have to answer the question. So defining a narrow enough FOIA request can be really tricky, and that's there's an art to it. That's something that people get trained to do well.
John Wonderlich, Policy Director at the SunlightFoundation. We're talking about the 46th anniversary of FOIA, the Freedom of Information Act. Michael joins us now from Jackson, Ohio, on our Republicans line. Good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Wonderlich. My name is, I work in Ohio, and I'm a VA patient. I filed a Freedom of Information Act request with the VA, and it was basically ignored. I sent it again. They continued to ignore it. They didn't even send me an acknowledgement, and the second time it went through the patient advocate's office. So there's a record of that, and yet they simply pretend that it doesn't exist. So as just a regular worker, what are my chances of actually filing in federal court and getting any kind of a response?
And Michael, were you asking for personal information about yourself, or were you asking a broader question about systems, treatments, services, things like that?
I was asking for something fairly simple. I was up for a treatment, and there was a policy manual on that, and it wasn't followed. So I wanted to go see the director and show him his own manual and say, this is what was supposed to have happened, and it didn't, and I'd like to know why. And so far, this was over a year ago. They've simply continued to ignore it. It was like, how dare you bother us with something like that?
So that sounds to me like a classic situation where FOIA would be an appropriate thing. Is to if you know that a manual exists that defines a procedure, and that sounds like a well-formed request that should be answerable. So if they haven't responded, I would consider talking to people that deal with freedom of information advocacy. You can Google around and say FOIA advocacy or FOIA nonprofit or questions like that, and try to find other people that deal with FOIA requests often and ask for their assistance. And there's also something called the Office of Government Information Services. It's a new office within the National Archives, and they're there to help be advocates for the public and to help the FOIA process work better. So that's another possible place to look for recourse.
Here's a question on Twitter. Robert asks, while I agree with FOIA, how much government time and money is spent on it?
So FOIA does take a significant investment. I mean, it's true. It takes a lot of time. We have a lot of staff devoted to filling Freedom of Information Act requests.
And that's in every federal agency, so if a request goes into the Department of Commerce, who actually deals with the request?
Right, it would be someone within the FOIA office at the Department of Commerce. So there are people dedicated to filling these requests at every agency. And so that's a lot of staff, and it's a lot of time that we spend on it. But I think if you look on balance at the value that having a Freedom of Information Act brings, it would be very hard to doubt the role that actually plays. I think it would be a lot more expensive to not have a FOIA and to look at the kind of waste and malfeasance and the kind of stuff that would happen if we didn't have it would cost us a lot more in the end.
Lee, Democrats line, Floral City, Florida. Welcome.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for the voice. I would like to state that possibly this working man that's usually asking the question is asking something about something that could possibly be a voice from the canary in the coal mine. And currently, there's a situation that deals with 40 years ago in Vietnam, the way things were handled, and things were a little bit iffy, and there was no information available. You just did what you were told. And now we're dealing with a new cancer from Agent Orange, and it's time to find out why.
So one of my favorite organizations to work with is called the National Security Archive, and they're a nonprofit just like my organization, the SunlightFoundation. And the National Security Archive has two main ways they do their work. They submit freedom of information requests, and they require information that was once classified to be declassified through review processes that happen. And basically, they're able to get lots and lots of information about what has happened through often military exercises or national security into the public domain that was never released before. And so that's a great source for information like the kind of things you're talking about. I would check out the National Security Archive.
John Wonderlich is policy director at the Sunlight Foundation. He spearheads Sunlight's goal of changing the government by opening up key data sources and information and making it more accountable to citizens. He works on issues of transparency, from legislation in Congress to ethics issues to information in the executive branch. Mark is our next caller, independent line in Glen, Michigan. Good morning.
Yes, good morning, Cspan.
Hi.
And happy 4th of July, America. And hello, Mr. John. It's hard to understand your name. But anyways,
Wonderlich. Wonderlich is his name, Mark.
Yes. My comment is it was about a natural-born citizen. I was born in Germany on an American Air Force base, but that doesn't make me a German citizen. You have to have two parents to be a natural-born citizen of from the same country.
Mark, our last guest, dispelled that myth. The conservative director of the Heritage Foundation told us that in the Constitution, that is not what it says. It says you have to be born in America to be considered an American citizen. Let's go on to Peter, an independent caller in L.A., California. Hi.
Hi, how are you all this morning?
Good, how are you?
Good. I just was wondering, the Freedom of Information Act, at what point will it kick in as far as the Kennedy assassination? It seems to me that Oswald, as the lone gunman supposedly, is guaranteed protections from the American people ever learning about what documents the government has on the Kennedy assassination.
So the Freedom of Information Act is always in effect. So I think that records having to do with the assassination are among the most requested and most sought after, and there's obviously a lot of public interest in that. But you are still free and always have been to submit a Freedom of Information Act request about any documents relating to that. Perhaps more relevant is whether there are other additional documents that have been classified that will become declassified in the future that you could access through the National Archives. And I deal with those questions less, but that's when you look at finding new information, I think the declassification process is more likely to show us something new about that than the FOIA is.
Matt says, looking at the great service that FOIA provides, I wonder if there's any effort or need to expand the law and bring increasing transparency.
So that's a great question. I think there are lots of ways that FOIA needs to change moving forward. One of them is that it's possible for the process of submitting requests and getting responses to be much more efficient. If you look in England, in the United Kingdom, they have a website called What Do They Know, where any citizen or anyone around the world can submit a request through the website, and they email and send it directly to the right government representative, and then when they send back the response, it's public and on the internet. And there's some effort in the U.S. to build a similar system, both outside the government and within the government. That's one, certainly, way that it could change for the better. And there are a lot of other amendments that would be reasonable ways to improve how the FOIA works, and sometimes to deal with some of those exceptions, which are often abused and used as ways to withhold information that really shouldn't be withheld.
Let's hear from Andrea in New York, Democrats line. Good morning.
Hi. My question for your guest is, I have some documents that my grandfather had requested about himself through the Freedom of Information Act from the CIA, spanning from the 50s, I'd say, to the early 70s. And he since passed away, and I have possession of them. And what I'm wondering about them is they're heavily redacted. If I were to request those same documents now, it's been like 20 or 30 years, would they be as heavily redacted? Would they just come to me in that same form?
So two points. One is that getting documents at different times or through different offices will often result in different levels of redaction. So that's a useful check, is if two different agencies have the same memo that they've sent each other, sometimes you get different pieces redacted from each one. So that can be a great way to get around the redaction that they're doing. The other point is that there's often confusion between Privacy Act requests and Freedom of Information Act requests. And generally when people write to an agency and say, I'd like to have the information that you have about me personally, that's generally a Privacy Act request, which is related but not quite the same as a FOIA request.
And when we talk about FOIA and the way it's evolved and changed over the years, how does it relate to emails? Can you request emails that a federal agency or person has sent or received? And then what about texts?
Yeah, so it does apply to digital records and to emails. Often now some of the juiciest conversations that are relevant to questions of political power happen over email, back and forth throughout the day. There's a ton of records in email, and just imagine all the things that we could know if we could look through all that email. So that is a very fruitful place for FOIA requests. When you look at things like texts or other records, sometimes there are fights over whether public records laws or FOIA should apply to text messages or other electronic messages. The state of Utah just had a huge fight about this question where they tried to restrict their freedom of information laws and say, oh, it doesn't really apply if it's a text message or if it's on my personal phone and not my work phone. And they tried to draw a lot of really restrictive lines around the FOIA. And basically, like, if the FOIA doesn't apply to anything where official work is being done, then you end up gutting it, because the real interesting conversations will end up happening just past whatever you can get through the FOIA. So it's really important that we protect freedom of information laws that can follow the important information wherever it is.
And we saw Governor Palin of Alaska using a personal email account and saying that should be exempted from requests for information. Mm-hmm. How are the courts or entities dealing with what's considered to be personal versus what's considered to be private?
Right, so there's a lot of different questions wrapped up in this question of using your private email for official work duties, which absolutely shouldn't happen, especially for a governor. Or it's also wrapped up in questions of records retention. So if someone submits a FOIA request and you don't want something to get out as say a governor, you can just destroy all the records. And that's something that he did when he left as governor, was just to destroy all the records that he had from his time as governor, which is kind of shocking and in most states is illegal. So there are a lot of questions wrapped up in what can a FOIA request reach, what has to be preserved as required by law because of records management laws. And then there's also questions of, if there's a lawsuit, what kind of things can be subpoenaed or found through discovery in the court process. And basically each of those lines is a little bit different.
All right, thank you so much. John Wonderlich, Policy Director of the Sunlight Foundation, talking about the Freedom of Information Act and its 46th anniversary. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.